Good morning. If you'll take your songbooks and turn to number 145, I love to tell the story. We're going to do the first, second, and the fourth verse. I love to tell the story of unseen things above, of Jesus and his glory, of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story because I know 'tis true. It satisfies my longing as nothing else can do. I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story, more wonderful it seems, the seed of all a golden dream. I love to tell the story, it did so much for me, and that is just the reason I tell it now to thee. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story for those who know its theme. The story so it's there's nothing doesn't do. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. I got lost somewhere in there. We have a prayer request. Okay. It's Donna.
We got a couple families in church that that's what
Any more prayer requests? Brother Ed, could you lead us in prayer, please, sir?
Heavenly Father, so thank you for these blessings. Thank you, Lord. I just come to your house this morning, Lord, sing songs that praises your name. We just praise Brother Robert, who teaches this morning. Lord, we just ask you to be with him. And Lord, we just pray for those that are not here tonight, this morning, those that are sick, that's strong, that's in rehab, Lord, and those that are just sick, Lord, need healing touch. Pray for Abby, Lord, that she had this young girl that broke her hip, and Lord, just pray that it heals properly. And I ask you to be with us as we go through this day, the remainder of this day. We pray for our pastor as he brings your word later on this morning. Lord, we just pray for visitors, Lord, coming for the fall festival, coming for the fall festival. We just pray those that, Lord, that does not know you as their Savior, Lord, that they'll see the love of Christ through us. In your Son's name we pray.
Thank you, Randy. Do we have any birthdays or anniversaries this past week? Anybody have a birthday or anniversary? Okay. Say what? Oh, Miss Norma. Oh, Miss Billy and Miss Norma. Okay, let's stand and sing happy birthday to them. Everybody stand up. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, God bless you. Happy birthday to you. All right, that's great. Let's take and turn our Bibles to Acts chapter 10. Well, we had a great Sunday school activity to Palisades Park. Everybody seemed to like that. I'm glad we all were able to go. We're already looking for our November activity, looking at different areas. So stay tuned and we'll announce a Sunday school activity for November. Yeah, December we could do our drive-through Christmas. That'll be one thing, but we also have probably something else. Well, here we see in chapters 20, verses 24 through 43, we see the conversion of Cornelius. We see that last week we were introduced to a man named Cornelius, and he was a Roman soldier, a centurion, but he needed the Lord. He was a very godly man, but he needed the Lord. And God also was working in the heart of Peter. As he sent the men to Peter, he was working in Peter's heart about accepting Gentiles and as fellow believers. Up until that time, only Jews had been saved, and Peter wouldn't have anything to do with Gentiles, nor any of the other Jewish disciples, because they were Gentiles and not Jewish. So God would sent down a sheet from heaven, if you remember, full of unclean animals. He told him to rise and eat. And he said, I'm not going to eat that. Not so, Lord. And the Lord said, what I've declared clean, you don't say it's unclean. And so he did it 3 times to try to get Peter's attention. And then finally, the sheet was pulled away. And as Peter was thinking on those things, the men showed up at the door, asking him to come to talk to Cornelius. And that's where we come in at verse 24. We see the meeting. And I forgot my little clicker. We see the meeting. Here the meeting we have in verses 24 through 33. Verse 24, it says, starting in verse 23. Then he called them in and lodged them. So God was already working on their heart. Appreciate that. God was already working on their heart. That they were, normally he wouldn't have had anything to do with a Gentile. He wouldn't have had them even in his house. He wouldn't have allowed them even to come in. But God was working on their heart. And he allowed them, the men, to come in. And they spent the night. And then it says he went with them. Again, verse 23, we see that God was still working. Because normally, he wouldn't have went with them either. Because if you go with them, then you got to sit, you got to eat. And you're going to have to eat with them or be a conflict of not to eat with them. Because they were unclean. And so, this would have been a problem. Normally, they wouldn't have traveled with a Gentile. But he's traveling with these Gentiles. And he went from Joppa all the way to Caesarea. You probably remember our map there. There was Joppa in the left there, and he's going up to Caesarea. Both of them are there by the sea. And we see that then when they got to Caesarea, verse 24, and the morrow after they entered into Caesarea, and Cornelius waited for them, and he called together his kinsmen and near friends. Cornelius was a ready subject. I mean, look at that. Cornelius was waiting for them. Wouldn't we like it if we went to, witness to somebody and knocked on their door and they're like, man, I'm glad you're here. I've been wanting to get saved, and that would be a wonderful time. And that's what happened with Cornelius here. When Peter got there, Cornelius was waiting on him, waiting to hear. Not only that, but he says he had called together his kinsmen and near friends. Cornelius knew that there was something he needed. He knew that there was something his kinsmen, his relatives, and his friends needed as well. He invited all them. Would that we were evangelizing the way that Cornelius was. Cornelius, he knew there was something he needed, so he called all his friends and family to hear about it as well. Then we can see verse 25. And as Peter was coming in, we see again, here was Peter, God working on Peter's heart. Normally, Peter wouldn't have went into the house of a Gentile, but Peter was coming in. God was changing Peter's heart. It says, as Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. So he was so happy that Cornelius fell down and worshipped him. But notice what happens in verse 26. But Peter took him up, saying, stand up, I myself also am a man. So Peter refused to worship. Peter wouldn't let him worship him. Peter was horrified at the thought. Now we can see a few things here. One thing we can see that Jesus had allowed worship. When Jesus was here on this earth, Jesus had allowed it because Jesus is God. If Jesus had been just a good man, he wouldn't have allowed worship. But everyone else who's not God, even angels, they refuse worship. They don't want you falling down and worshiping them. We see that people today who want to be worshiped or allow people to worship them are not. That's not scriptural. To have other people worship you, have other people put you up on a pedestal. Not even worship, not even scriptural to have someone kiss your ring. Peter didn't say, don't worship me, but I'm going to have you kiss my ring or nothing else. Peter said, no, I'm just a man, just like you are. I'm on the same ground. As they say, all ground is level at the cross. He was there. He was just a man who had a message that Cornelius needed to hear. Now, we might criticize other groups about worship, but how often do we want to get puffed up about the things that we're doing? Maybe we teach a lesson, or we preach a sermon, or we sing a special. And it's easy to get puffed up and expect other people to acknowledge us. We preach a message perhaps, or teach a lesson, and people get saved, and we say, boy, look at me. Look what I did. But really, we didn't do anything. Or maybe there's we sing a song, and God works in someone's heart, and people start moving. We're like, man, I did great. I moved people. But really, we didn't do anything. God did it all. When we begin focusing on ourselves, we ignore God's working. Think of Peter. If Peter had taken on this worship, think how foolish that would have been. Peter was only there because God was working in his heart. Peter was only there because what God had done in his heart. Other than in and of himself, Peter wouldn't have been there at all. Peter wouldn't have acknowledged him at all. But God was working. We can also see that he would have been ignoring God's will. God's will was for him to come. He was only coming because God had sent him. God had worked in his heart and God had sent him. And then he was only there because of God's wisdom. God had known all things. God had grouped them together. God had had him look at the sheet, the vision, just right before the men had gotten there at the door. So we can see that God was at work. God was the one that deserved all the praise. And Peter didn't deserve any of the praise. And that's the way it is for us as well. If we do something, we can't pat ourselves on the back and say, man, I did a great job. But no, we can say, God used me. And how wonderful it was that God chose to use me and work through me to change these people's lives. And how wonderful it was that God worked through me, that I was even willing to do this. I was willing to stand up and tell. God deserves all the praise all the way around. And we don't deserve any of the praise. We see then that verse 27 says, as he talked with him, he went in and found many that were come together. So as you can see that Cornelius was a right prospect there. He was waiting, and many were there. Verse 28, and he said unto them, you know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company, or come unto one of another nation, but God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Now, Peter was not being rude here. You might say, man, why is he calling him unclean or common? But Peter's explaining to him that normally he wouldn't have been there. I'm sure Cornelius knew that Jews despised the Romans. He despised the Romans and he despised the Gentiles. Really, Peter had a double reason to despise Cornelius. For one reason, he was a Gentile. You know, and they wouldn't have anything to do with the Gentiles. They considered Gentiles to be dogs and unclean. They despised them. But also, to add insult to injury, Cornelius was also a soldier of the Roman army, the occupying army. They wanted to get the occupying army out, and Cornelius was part of the problem. So often, we can fall into that trap. We can see things that we don't agree with, and we see people that fall into that group, and we're like, man, that I don't agree with that politically, or I don't agree with that lifestyle, or whatever it is. And we forget that we need to evangelize that person. We need to tell that person the good news of salvation. And that's what Peter is saying here. Peter's saying, God, normally I wouldn't have had anything to do with you. I would have stayed away, but God is working in my heart. And God is working to bring us together. God is doing something special here. That's what he's acknowledging here. And then it goes on, verse 29. Therefore came unto you without gainsaying. As soon as I was sent for, I asked therefore, for what intent ye have sent for me? That's always a good thing to ask. They say that if someone comes back, if you're a counselor, let's say Bible time or something else, and someone comes back, sometimes it's easy just to assume what they're back there for, and just start off with your spiel or whatever, and you be totally off base of what they really want. But Peter had it right here. Peter asked, he said, why did you send for me? And then Cornelius told him. Also, it's able to get Cornelius, focused on why he did come, why he did ask for him. Verse 30, Cornelius said, 4 days ago I was fasting until this hour. And at the 9th hour I prayed in my house, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and said, Cornelius, thy prayer is heard, and thine alms are had in remembrance in the sight of God. Send therefore to Joppa, and call hither Simon, whose surname is Peter. He is lodged in the house of one Simon the tanner by the seaside, who when he cometh shall speak unto thee. Immediately therefore I sent to thee, and thou hast well done that thou art come. Now therefore are we all here present before God to hear all things that are commanded thee of God. So he said here, God told me that I needed to send for you to come. Notice verse 30 says he was fasting, and at the 9th hour he was praying. So he was doing good works. He was a good man, but God knew his goodness wouldn't get him to heaven. He needed more. And Cornelius had an angel appear to him. That's that man in bright clothing. An angel appeared to him and told him where he needed to go. He directed him exactly what he needed to do. And notice verse 33, immediately therefore I sent to you. We saw last week, when he was convicted, he did it immediately. So often people put it off and the conviction is gone or whatever. They say, man, I'll do it later. I'll get saved later. And maybe later never comes. You think about Paul, as he was standing before a Roman emperor. He said, almost thou hast persuaded me. Come again when I have a more opportune time. And as far as we know, there never was a more opportune time. He never called him back and got saved. And how terrible that is to put it off. And people put it off all the time. But Cornelius didn't do that. Cornelius wanted to be saved. And notice what he says there. He says, all things that are commanded thee of God. He was a soldier, and he was ready to give commands. So he saw God telling him to send for Peter as a command. And he saw Peter giving the word as a command as well. He knew that God was in control. He knew that whatever happened was directed by God. And how wonderful that is that God was working in Cornelius' heart. It also was working in Peter's heart. Some have entitled chapter 10, the conversion of Cornelius. And that's what I titled it as well. But some also have titled it, and have pointed out, it's also the conversion of Peter. Now, Peter didn't get saved, but Peter's whole attitude toward people changed. Peter realized that everyone needed the gospel. Not only the Jews, not only even the Samaritans, but even the Gentiles. And you and I need to realize that as well, that everyone needs the gospel. No matter what their culture, no matter what their background, and no matter even what their sinful lifestyle is, they need the gospel. They need to be saved. And then we see in verses 34 through 43, we see Peter's sermon. And he starts out, It says, Then Peter opened his mouth and said, Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. So Peter began speaking, and he says, I perceive. Now that's the idea of basically an aha moment. You know, he's acknowledging that finally he was figuring it out. You ever do something and suddenly you don't realize what's going on? Someone will say something to you, and then all of a sudden, a few moments later, the light bulb will pop on. I already know what that person was saying now. You know, I realize what's going on. I was in the dark about that. I didn't recognize it. I don't realize it. But now you realize just what was going on. You realize what was happening. And that's the way it was there, that he's saying, you know, I perceive it. I'm figuring it out. The light bulb is coming on. I'm understanding that God is no respecter of persons. Now, this was new to Peter, but it wasn't new to God. Even in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 17, it says, For the Lord